Well, here's the paradox. Clearly, if you ask me for one thing that would help Israel's image, it's a very simple answer. Resolve the conflict with the Arab world. Since this is an easy task, what do we do next? Well, there's the problem, because once we've resolved the conflict, maybe we will lose all that wonderful international attention. So maybe on the contrary, we should actually keep the conflict. No, jokes aside, I'm far from naive, and I'm not at all convinced that even if, in a perfect world, if we can make peace with the entire Arab world next year, that would mean that we would suddenly enjoy the greatest degree of popularity around the world. I really probably don't believe that to be the case. But on the other hand, since there are other very good reasons to try and resolve the conflict, I think that one of the side effects might well be that we will be able to maintain a certain presence and a certain degree of interest, but as you put it, use more of the soft power and try and promote the aspects of Israel that the way we like to do it. And Christophe mentioned a few of the successes in France. There is no reason why it shouldn't happen elsewhere. But again, I'm not convinced that will entirely resolve the problem. What I do believe is that even today, while we are still fighting the war, both in reality and in international media, and it is part of the war, there is absolutely no doubt about this, it is important to try and push other images into the bank of images that the average citizen of the world holds about Israel. Because as I said, even in a perfect world, if the conflict were resolved within a short period of time, I wouldn't want people to keep as the only dominant image of Israel that they will maintain in their memory images of Israeli tanks versus Palestinian children. Because A, they are not true, and B, they don't represent what I believe to be Israel. So let's all make an effort and try and enrich that image bank that they own, so that even if the conflict disappears and we lose some of the international attention, something positive will remain in their conscience.
Thank you. Now I will introduce Carlos Nuno Oliveira, who is arrived now, and he's a Secretary of State for Entrepreneurship, Competitiveness and Innovation of the Government of Portugal. We are very pleased to have you with us. I understand that before becoming a politician, you have had an interesting professional experience with Microsoft. Does it influence the way you look at the state of Israel?
Thank you very much. I apologize for the delay. I was meeting with the Chief Scientific Officer as I'm here in Israel in an official visit, where we are trying to foster the relationships between Portugal and Israel. And trying to answer a bit to what I was hearing from the colleagues here in the panel, I think that's a way as well to enhance the image of Israel in European countries is really by fostering these economical and cultural relationships. And this visit here that I'm doing as a goal of increasing the economic relationships, but as well learning with something that is very positive from Israel that we see in Europe, which is the ability to develop innovation and the entrepreneurial sector. And this is being an inspiration for us in Portugal while building the new policies for innovation and entrepreneurship. And I think this is clearly an asset that Israel has that can foster and deliver to Europe as an example of what Europe needs to do while in this turmoil. Only with innovation, with more with products that can be sold throughout the world. Europe will win this battle towards competitiveness that we are facing right now. And I think that Israel has shown that you have used some very interesting ideas to develop. Going to your, and my personal experience, I had the opportunity to do business here in Israel. I founded my company that I later on sold to Microsoft. But in between, I was able to visit Israel as a businessman and to do business here in Israel. And it was also a very interesting moment because the culture between Portugal and Israel in many, we have lots of similarities in many areas, and I believe with other European countries, that made us very easy to do business here, even in very innovative and high technology areas. And again, I think that the image of Israel in who is in the world, and my world was the world of innovation and high technologies and mobile services, is that Israel is leading the world in this arena. And so I think, again, is an asset that should be used. So the fact that when I joined Microsoft, after Microsoft acquired my company, I had the chance to work with several Israeli members of the R&D Center here in Israel and others. And again, the European ones, the Portuguese ones, and the Israeli ones had a more aligned vision on how things should move on in terms of business, in terms of product creation, than what we were feeling from some of the American counterparts in Redmond, which was very interesting to feel as these links that we have. So I'd say that we have, from innovation perspective, a very positive image of Israel, from what you've done here in the past 20 or 25 years to become what you are today. And I believe that bilateral and multilateral relationships that will foster more economical development and more trade between countries in Europe would certainly be of positive for Israel and certainly for Portugal in our case.
Thank you. Mr. Michaelis.
I would like to follow up on the first question you asked me and simply say that there's a big difference when I, as a German ambassador, talk to groups of young visiting German students. When the conversation, when the dialogue starts from the point of view of the German guilt, of the German responsibility, usually you find a very sensitive way into the story of Israel. Towards the end of such a conversation, young people simply understand how one story comes out of the other story. I know historically, you can put a few question marks, but generally and emotionally, the two are very connected. If, however, the same group, and that has happened to me several times, has visited the Palestinian territories before, and they have seen Hebron, for instance, on a day tour, and they come and I talk to them, and they immediately start with questions about the reality on the ground in Hebron, it's almost impossible to arrive at the same point. So the lesson I draw from this is that the story of Israel, the image of Israel, is very much a biographical story, not just in this big historical perspective, but also in a smaller historical perspective. I think Christophe made reference to it. Also in Germany, Israeli literature is translated in very, very high number. The 10,000s of copies of Zeruiah Shalev, of Nir Ba'am, of Edgar Keret, of Ron Leshem. So I don't mention the Grossmans and the Amos Oz. I mention writers who don't even sell, the very thousands of copies in the state of Israel. But Germans are very interested in reading these stories and going through them. And I think and I know from talking to them that through these stories they understand. There was reference to the old concept of Hasbara. I think Hasbara, in a way, is a kind of aggressive sales policy. I don't think Israel needs an aggressive sales policy. There are aspects of Israeli policy that cannot be explained, that will always come over as negative in Europe. And I think Israel has to accept that and live with it to a certain extent, because you only understand if you really live in the country that you couldn't do and couldn't solve it in a different way. But there are other aspects of Israeli policy that can be explained, and that can much better be explained in a sometimes self-critical attitude, where those Israelis that try to tell the story look at their face in the mirror and tell the story in this way. I think that's very important, because that wins European hearts, if it matters whether Europeans like it or not.
Thank you. Mr. Standley?
Thanks very much. With regard to Israel's image and how to improve it, the paradox is that Israel had the world's most successful image development program for maybe 3 decades, where you had hundreds of thousands of people coming to Israel at no cost to Israel. 95% of those, probably after being in Israel, went back, not as ambassadors of Israel necessarily, but with very positive images and experiences. And that was obviously the kibbutz volunteer program, of which I'm a proud product. So we can be nostalgic about the kibbutz days and so on, but I mean, there was a system that really had a tremendously positive effect. And I think in a way, some of the changes, I mean, I don't want to overemphasize the fact that that generation of people who came from the 60s to the 80s or the 90s as volunteers are now occupying positions of responsibility or some responsibility in Europe, but it's definitely had an effect. And the fact that there are no more people in that category being produced maybe also reflects to some very modest extent the difficulties in terms of maintaining and continuing to sustain positive images and stories of Israel. But I think leaving, I mean, I said that somewhat lightheartedly, though I believe that, did have an impact. But I think Israel is a very special case. It's a very special country. It's a unique country, which both brings positive and favorable elements and connotations, but also particular challenges. And I think the particular challenges are that, whether you like it or not, and I think this is an issue that's come up in every single observation made by my co-panelists, the excessive and unique degree of scrutiny to which Israel is exposed in all of its actions, which is unrivaled, unparalleled anywhere else in the world, but it's a fact. I mean, that's not going to go away. And it clearly is linked to the persistence and the lack of solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we know that that is something which is going to take a very long time. Well, we would hope that it can be resolved quickly, but for the time being, it doesn't seem to be happening immediately, at least. So that's a situation that Israel is going to have to live with. I mean, what concerns me perhaps is that I believe actually that in Europe people do have a great deal of information about the positive aspect of Israel. I think the vibrancy of the arts and research, startup nations, political stability, democracy, the rule of law, these are things which are well known in Israel. Far too often, when you talk to people in Europe about this, you bring this to their attention, the response is always, yes, but. Yes, we acknowledge that Israel is all of the things that you've described, but A, there's still the Palestinian conflict, and B, we're concerned about the way the Arab minority in Israel still does not achieve the same status, either political or in socioeconomic development terms, as the Jewish majority. So that yes, but is something that really needs to be addressed in a very forthright and systematic way. But I think that the specificity and the uniqueness of Israel is such that these challenges will always remain. I think that an honest attempt to explain, as my German colleague has said, the personal reality, the biographic nature of the story of Israel, I think is something which is important. I mean, Israeli officials and voices or representatives, I think, do try to explain to European audiences the vulnerability of Israel in strategic security terms. I think that message gets across. But again, the response is, yes, but. I mean, why should Israel have to face these challenges? It's facing these challenges because there's still a conflict. And I think there we should not underestimate the fact that we in Europe for the last 60 years have gone through a model of international relations and relations with neighboring countries, which is obviously dramatically different from ours. I mean, we are almost committed in Europe to a model of international relations which is based on mutual vulnerability, which is clearly something that has no relevance in Israel. And I hope that people in Europe can understand that Israel finds itself in a completely different context, where our model that we have successfully developed and defended for the last 60 plus years in Europe does not apply to the circumstances here. But again, I think it's important to understand that
Go for Europe conference.